The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to the air, sharp and unyielding, as Margaret sat on the edge of the hospital bed. Her hands, wrinkled and veined from 7 decades of life, twisted the thin paper gown. The room was too quiet, save for the faint hum of machinery and the occasional footsteps echoing in the hallway. At 70, Margaret had faced her share of hardships, losing her parents young, raising 2 children through lean years, and weathering the storms of a marriage that wasn't always kind. But nothing had prepared her for this moment. Dr. Ellis entered, his face a practiced mask of compassion. He adjusted his glasses, the chart in his hands trembling slightly. "Margaret," he began, his voice soft but steady. "The biopsy results are back. It's stage 3 breast cancer." The words landed like a physical blow, stealing her breath. Her mind raced, grasping for something solid to hold on to. Cancer. Stage 3. She'd heard stories. Of course, friends, neighbors, distant cousins, but it was always something that happened to other people. Not her. Not now, when she'd finally found a rhythm to her days. A fragile peace with her husband, Harold, after years of tension. She nodded, lips pressed tightly together, and asked the questions she'd rehearsed in her mind since the lump was found. What were the treatment options? What was the prognosis? Dr. Ellis answered with measured precision: surgery, chemotherapy, radiation, a survival rate that hovered around 50% with aggressive treatment. She clung to the numbers, trying to make sense of them, but they blurred into a haze of fear and uncertainty. When the doctor left, promising to schedule a consultation with an oncologist, Margaret sat in silence, staring at the pale blue curtain that separated her from the rest of the world. She thought of Harold, her husband of 45 years. He was waiting at home, probably tinkering in the garage, oblivious to the storm that had just broken over their lives. She needed him now, more than ever. The thought of telling him filled her with dread, not because of the diagnosis itself, but because of the fragile thread that held their marriage together. Their love had been passionate once, in the early days when they were young and reckless, building a life on dreams and promises. But time had worn those promises thin. Harold's temper, his wandering eye, the years he'd spent emotionally distant, they'd left scars. They'd fought, reconciled, fought again, and somehow stayed together. Retirement had softened him, or so she thought. They'd found a quiet routine: morning coffee, evening walks, shared laughter over old movies. She dared to hope they were finally okay. She drove home that afternoon, the weight of the diagnosis pressing against her chest. The familiar streets of their small town blurred past Main Street with its quaint shops, the park where their kids used to play, the church where they'd renewed their vows on their 30th anniversary. Everything felt different now, fragile, like it could vanish with a single breath. Harold was in the living room when she walked in, sprawled on the recliner with a beer in hand, the TV blaring a football game. His gray hair was thinning, his face lined with years of sun and stress. But he still had that boyish charm that had once swept her off her feet. She stood in the doorway, unsure how to begin. "Harold," she said, her voice trembling despite her efforts to steady it. "We need to talk." He muted the TV, his brow furrowing. "What's wrong? Maggie, you look like you've seen a ghost." She took a deep breath, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "It's cancer. Breast cancer. Stage 3. His face went slack, the beer bottle slipping slightly in his grip. For a moment, he said nothing, just stared at her as if she'd spoken a foreign language. Then he stood, crossing the room to pull her into a hug. It was awkward, stiff, not the warm embrace she'd hoped for. But she leaned into it anyway, desperate for comfort. "We'll get through this," he said, his voice gruff. "You're tough. Tougher than me." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe in the strength of their bond, in the promises they'd made all those years ago. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something flicker fear. Yes, but something else too. Something she couldn't name. That night, she lay awake, listening to Harold's uneven snores. The diagnosis played on a loop in her mind, each repetition carving deeper into her resolve. She thought of her children, now grown with lives of their own, and her grandchildren, who filled her heart with joy. She thought of the life she'd built, the sacrifices she'd made, the love she'd poured into her family. She wasn't ready to let go. The next morning, Harold was quieter than usual. He made coffee, set out her favorite mug, but his eyes avoided hers. She told herself it was shock, that he needed time to process. They'd faced hard times before, surely this would be no different. But as the days passed, his silence grew heavier, his presence more distant. He'd leave the house for hours, claiming errands, but return with nothing to show for it. Phone calls came late at night, hushed conversations he'd take in the garage, out of earshot. Margaret tried to focus on her treatment plan. She met with the oncologist, scheduled surgery, and researched chemotherapy side effects until her head spun. She needed Harold's support, needed him to be her rock. But he was slipping away, and she didn't know why. One evening, a week after the diagnosis, she found him packing a suitcase in their bedroom. Her heart stopped. "Harold, what are you doing?" He didn't look at her, his hands fumbling with a stack of shirts. "I can't do this, Maggie," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't watch you go through this. It's too much." Her knees buckled, and she gripped the doorframe for support. "What are you saying?" "I'm leaving," he said, finally meeting her eyes. There was guilt there, but also resolve. "I'm going back to Linda." Linda, his ex-girlfriend from decades ago, the one he'd dated before Margaret, the one he'd never quite let go of in his heart. Margaret had always known Linda lingered in the background of their marriage, a shadow that surfaced in fleeting comments or wistful looks. But she'd never imagined this. "You're leaving me now." Her voice cracked, anger and disbelief warring within her. "I have cancer. Harold, I need you." "I'm sorry," he said, zipping the suitcase shut. I can't." And with that, he walked out, leaving her standing in the wreckage of their life together. The door clicked shut, and the silence that followed was louder than any words. Margaret sank to the floor, her hands covering her face as sobs tore through her. She was alone, facing the fight of her life, abandoned by the man she'd loved for nearly half a century. But as the tears slowed, something else stirred within her, a spark of defiance, a refusal to break. She'd survived worse. She'd raised children, rebuilt after financial ruin, endured years of Harold's flaws. If he couldn't stand by her now, she'd find a way to stand on her own. She didn't know it yet, but the insurance policy Harold had never bothered to read held a secret that would change everything. A secret that would give her not just the means to fight her illness, but the power to reclaim her life. The days after Harold left were a blur of silence and routine. Margaret moved through the house like a ghost, her footsteps echoing in rooms that felt too large without him. The kitchen table, where they'd shared countless meals, now held only her coffee mug, its handle chipped from years of use. The recliner where Harold spent his evenings sat untouched, a silent accusation of his absence. She avoided their bedroom, sleeping instead on the couch, unable to face the empty side of the bed. Her children, Emily and David, rallied around her as best they could. Emily, a nurse in Chicago, called daily, her voice bright but strained, offering medical advice and gentle reassurances. David, who lived closer, drove down from Portland with his wife and kids, filling the house with noise and warmth for a weekend. The grandchildren's laughter was a balm, but when they left, the quiet returned, sharper than before. Margaret's surgery was scheduled for the following week, a lumpectomy followed by weeks of chemotherapy. She spent hours researching, filling notebooks with questions for her doctors. Knowledge was her anchor, a way to wrest control from the chaos of her diagnosis and Harold's betrayal. But no amount of research could fill the hole he'd left. One morning, while sorting through a pile of mail, she found a thick envelope from their insurance company. Harold had always handled the finances, waving off her attempts to understand the policies with a dismissive, "I've got it covered, Maggie." She'd trusted him, assuming he'd read the fine print, made the right choices. Now, with him gone, she tore open the envelope, her hands trembling. The policy was dense, filled with jargon she barely understood. But as she skimmed the pages, one clause caught her eye, a critical illness rider, added years ago when they'd updated their coverage. It promised a lump sum payment upon diagnosis of certain conditions, including breast cancer. The amount was staggering enough to cover her treatments, experimental therapies, even home care if needed. Harold had never mentioned it. Had he even known? She called the insurance company, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. The representative confirmed it. The payout was hers. No strings attached, as long as she submitted the medical documentation. It was a lifeline, a chance to fight the cancer without the crushing weight of financial ruin. But it also meant Harold had left her to face this alone, oblivious to the safety net he'd unknowingly provided. Anger flared, hot and sharp. How could he walk away without even checking? How could he abandon her without a thought for what she'd need? The betrayal cut deeper than the diagnosis. But the policy gave her something she hadn't felt in weeks: power. She wasn't helpless. She wasn't at his mercy. Margaret threw herself into preparing for surgery. She cleaned the house, organized her medical records, and called Emily to discuss the treatment plan. She avoided thinking about Harold, though his absence lingered in every corner. At night, when sleep wouldn't come, she'd sit by the window, staring at the stars, wondering where he was. Had he gone to Linda's? Were they laughing together, pretending the past 45 years hadn't happened? The thought made her chest ache, but she pushed it away, focusing on the fight ahead. The day before her surgery, David came by with a stack of old photo albums. "Thought you might want these," he said, his eyes soft with concern. They sat together, flipping through faded pictures, Margaret and Harold on their wedding day, young and beaming, family vacations at the lake, Christmases with the kids. Each image was a reminder of what they'd built and what he'd thrown away. "He doesn't deserve you, Mom," David said quietly, his hand resting on hers. She squeezed his hand, tears prickling her eyes. "I know," she whispered. But knowing didn't erase the pain. The surgery went as well as could be expected. The doctors removed the tumor, and though the recovery was grueling pain, fatigue, the constant fear of what the pathology report would say, Margaret felt a quiet strength growing within her. She wasn't just fighting for survival. She was fighting for herself, for the woman she'd been before Harold's shadow had dimmed her light. When the insurance payout arrived, it was more than she'd imagined. She paid off medical bills, set aside funds for future treatments, and, on a whim, hired a lawyer. She didn't know what she'd do with the information yet, but she wanted to understand her options. Harold had left her to drown, but she was learning to swim. As she recovered, she began to notice small things. The way the morning light filtered through the kitchen curtains. The taste of fresh strawberries from the farmer's market. The sound of her granddaughter's voice on the phone. Life, despite everything, was still here, waiting for her to claim it. One afternoon, while sorting through Harold's old desk, she found a letter tucked in a drawer. It was from Linda, dated years ago, before their marriage had settled into its uneasy truce. The words were a punch to the gut, Linda begging Harold to leave Margaret, promising a life free of responsibility, of her endless demands. Margaret's hands shook as she read, rage and grief twisting together. Harold hadn't just left her now, had been halfway out the door for years. She burned the letter in the backyard, watching the flames consume it. As the ashes drifted into the evening sky, she made a promise to herself. She would not let Harold's cowardice define her. She had cancer to fight, a life to live, and a strength she was only beginning to understand. Chemotherapy was a battlefield, each session a grueling assault on Margaret's body and spirit. The first round left her nauseous, her silver hair thinning in clumps, her energy sapped to the point where climbing the stairs felt like scaling a mountain. But she refused to surrender. She'd wake each morning, force herself to eat, and drive to the hospital with a playlist of old jazz standards, Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong, to keep her spirits up. Her children took turns visiting, Emily flying in for a week, David bringing the grandkids to distract her with board games and stories. Their love was a lifeline, but it couldn't fill the void Harold had left. Margaret tried not to think of him, but his absence was a wound that refused to heal. She'd catch herself glancing at the phone, half expecting a call that never came. The insurance money gave her options she hadn't dared hope for. She enrolled in a clinical trial for a new targeted therapy, something her oncologist described as promising. It was a risk, but Margaret was done playing it safe. She'd spent too much of her life compromising, bending to Harold's moods, sacrificing her dreams for his comfort. Now, it was her turn to fight for herself. Between treatments, she found solace in small acts of rebellion. She bought a bright red scarf to cover her thinning hair, a bold contrast to the muted tones she'd worn for years to please Harold. She signed up for a pottery class at the community center, her hands trembling as they shaped clay into lopsided bowls. The other women in the class, some her age, some younger, became a quiet support network, sharing stories of their own struggles over coffee and laughter. One day, while cleaning out the attic, Margaret found a box of her old journals. She'd kept them in her 20s, before marriage and motherhood had consumed her time. The pages were filled with dreams she'd forgotten, traveling to Paris, opening a small bakery, writing a novel. She sat on the attic floor, dust motes swirling in the sunlight, and read until her eyes burned. Who was that young woman, so full of hope? And where had she gone? The journals sparked something in her. She started writing again, late at night when the house was quiet. At first, it was just fragments, memories, fears, the raw ache of Harold's betrayal. But soon, the words began to take shape, weaving a story of a woman who'd lost everything but found herself in the ruins. It wasn't just therapy. It was a reclamation, a way to make sense of the chaos. Her lawyer, a sharp woman named Clara, called with news about the insurance policy. "There's more," Clara said, her voice tinged with excitement. "The policy includes a spousal support clause. If Harold files for divorce, you're entitled to a portion of his assets, including any future earnings." He didn't read the fine print, did he? Margaret laughed, a bitter sound. He never did. Clara advised her to wait, to gather evidence of Harold's abandonment before making a move. Margaret agreed. But the knowledge gave her a spark of vindication. Harold thought he could walk away without consequence. But he was wrong. She wasn't just a sick old woman, he could discard. She was a force. And she was only beginning to understand her own power. The chemo sessions grew harder. The side effects more brutal. There were days when she could barely lift her head from the pillow. When the mirror showed a stranger's face pale, gaunt, eyes hollow with exhaustion. But even on those days, she'd drag herself to the kitchen, brew a pot of tea, and write. Each word was a victory, a defiance of the disease and the man who'd left her to face it alone. One evening, Emily came over with a surprise, a plane ticket to Chicago. "Come stay with me for a while," she said, her eyes pleading. "You don't have to do this alone." Margaret hesitated. The idea of leaving her home, her routine, was daunting. But the thought of being surrounded by her daughter's love, of escaping the ghosts of Harold's absence, was tempting. She agreed, packing a small bag with her journals, her red scarf, and a photo of her grandchildren. Chicago was a whirlwind of noise and light, so different from her quiet town. Emily's apartment was small but warm, filled with books and plants and the chatter of her teenage son, Jake. Margaret felt out of place at first, a relic in a modern world. But Jake's curiosity about her stories and Emily's gentle care eased her into a new rhythm. One night, over a glass of wine, Emily asked about Harold. "Have you heard from him?" Margaret shook her head. "Not a word. He's with Linda, I suppose." Emily's face hardened. "He doesn't deserve to know how strong you are." Margaret smiled. A small, fierce thing. "No, he doesn't." As the weeks passed, Margaret's strength grew, not just physically but emotionally. The clinical trial showed promise. Her scans were stable. The cancer hadn't spread. She began to dream again, not just of survival, but of a life beyond it. A life where she wasn't defined by Harold's choices or her illness, but by her own. Chicago was a revelation for Margaret. The city's pulse, its crowded streets, honking taxis, and vibrant energy felt like a challenge to her quiet resilience. She spent her days exploring with Jake, who dragged her to museums and coffee shops, his teenage enthusiasm infectious. At the Art Institute, she stood before a Monet painting, its soft colors blurring into a dreamscape, and felt a stirring she hadn't known in years. It wasn't just beauty. It was possibility. Her health was a roller coaster. Some days, the chemo left her too weak to leave the apartment, her body aching as if it were betraying her. Others, she felt almost normal, able to walk the lakefront with Emily, the wind sharp against her face. The clinical trial's results were cautiously optimistic. Her tumor markers were down, a small victory that felt monumental. She clung to these moments, storing them like treasures against the darker days. Writing became her refuge. In Emily's spare room, surrounded by plants and sunlight, Margaret filled pages with her story. It wasn't just about the cancer or Harold's betrayal. It was about the woman she was becoming. She wrote of her fears, her anger, but also her hope, her rediscovery of the dreams she'd buried long ago. Jake, curious about her journals, asked to read them. She hesitated but handed over a few pages, watching his face as he read. "Grandma," he said, his voice soft with awe, "this is really good. You should publish it." She laughed, brushing off the idea, but his words planted a seed. What if she could share her story? What if it could help someone else? Another woman facing betrayal or illness, to find their own strength. Back in her hometown, she'd felt small, defined by her role as Harold's wife, the mother who kept the family together. In Chicago, she was just Margaret Ryder, grandmother, survivor. The shift was subtle but profound. She started attending a local writing group, a mix of ages and backgrounds, where she shared snippets of her work. The feedback was kind but honest, pushing her to refine her voice, to dig deeper into the emotions she'd spent years suppressing. One evening, Clara, her lawyer, called with an update. "I've tracked down Harold," she said. "He's living with Linda in a condo upstate. No divorce papers yet, but I've got a private investigator keeping tabs. If you want to move forward, we can start building a case for spousal support." Margaret considered it. The insurance money had given her financial stability, but the idea of holding Harold accountable felt right. Not out of spite, but because she deserved it. She'd given him 45 years. Her loyalty, her love, and he'd walked away when she needed him most. "Let's do it," she told Clara, her voice firm. The writing group became a turning point. One member, a retired editor named Susan, offered to help polish her manuscript. "You've got something special here," Susan said, her eyes bright. "It's raw, honest. People need to hear this." Margaret threw herself into the revisions. Her days split between treatments, writing, and time with Emily and Jake. She started researching publishing options, a world she'd never imagined entering. The process was daunting: query letters, agents, rejection letters, but it gave her purpose, a reason to keep going beyond the next doctor's appointment. One afternoon, while walking along Lake Michigan, she got a call from David. "Mom, there's something you should know," he said, his voice tense. "Dad reached out. He wants to talk." Her heart lurched. "What did he say?" "Not much. Just that he's sorry. That he made a mistake. He wants to see you." Margaret stood still, the wind whipping her scarf. Part of her wanted to scream, to tell him to stay gone. But another part, the part that still remembered the man who danced with her at their wedding, wanted answers. Why had he left? What had Linda offered that she couldn't? "Tell him I'll think about it," she said finally. That night, she wrote a letter to Harold, not to send, but to understand her own heart. She poured out her pain, her anger, the love she'd carried for him despite everything. She wrote about the woman she was becoming, the strength she'd found in his absence. When she finished, she felt lighter, as if the words had lifted a weight she hadn't known she was carrying. The clinical trial continued to show promise, and her oncologist began talking about remission as a possibility. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was hope, and Margaret clung to it. She wasn't just fighting cancer anymore. She was fighting for a life she could call her own. As she mailed her first query letter to a literary agent, she felt a surge of pride. This was her story, her voice, and no one, not Harold, not the cancer, could take that from her. Margaret returned to her hometown after 3 months in Chicago, her body stronger, her spirit fiercer. The house felt different now, not empty, but hers. She'd rearranged the furniture, painted the living room a soft yellow, hung her pottery creations on the walls. It was a small act of defiance, a way to claim the space Harold had abandoned. Her health was improving. The clinical trial had reduced the tumor markers significantly, and her oncologist was optimistic about her chances of remission. Chemo was still grueling, but Margaret faced it with a determination she hadn't known she possessed. She'd started a blog, sharing excerpts of her writing, and to her surprise, it gained a small but loyal following. Readers, mostly women, left comments about their own struggles, their own betrayals. Margaret read each one, feeling a connection she'd never expected. Clara called with news. Harold had been served papers for spousal support. "He's not happy," Clara said, a hint of amusement in her voice. "Apparently, he thought you'd just let him walk away." Margaret smiled grimly. He thought wrong. She agreed to meet Harold, not out of forgiveness, but because she needed closure. They arranged to meet at a diner in town. Neutral Ground. When she walked in, her red scarf bright around her neck, she saw him at a corner booth, looking older, smaller. His shoulders were hunched, his eyes shadowed with guilt. "Maggie," he said, standing awkwardly. "You look good." She slid into the booth, her heart pounding but her face calm. "What do you want?" "Harold." He fumbled with his coffee cup, avoiding her gaze. "I made a mistake. Linda, it wasn't what I thought. I miss you. I want to come home." Her laugh was sharp, cutting through the diner's hum. "Home? You left me, Harold, when I was diagnosed with cancer. You ran to Linda without a backward glance." "I was scared," he said, his voice breaking. "I didn't know how to handle it. I thought I couldn't watch you suffer." "You didn't have to watch," she said, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath. "You just had to stay." He reached for her hand, but she pulled back. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know I messed up. But I love you, Maggie. I always have." She looked at him, really looked, and saw not the man she'd married, but a coward who'd chosen comfort over loyalty. The love she'd felt for him was still there, buried deep, but it wasn't enough. Not anymore. "You didn't read the insurance policy, did you?" she asked, her tone icy. He blinked, confused. "What?" "The critical illness rider. The spousal support clause. You left me to die, Harold, but you also left me with everything I need to rebuild. Without you." His face paled as she explained the payout, the legal steps she'd taken. For the first time, she saw fear in his eyes, not of her illness, but of her strength. "I don't want you back," she said, standing. "I'm done living in your shadow. I have a life to live, and I'm going to live it." She walked out, her head high, the weight of his gaze on her back. The air outside was crisp, the sky a brilliant blue. She felt free, unburdened by the man who'd once defined her. Back home, she poured her emotions into her writing. The blog grew, attracting the attention of a small press interested in her manuscript. She signed a contract, a milestone that felt like a triumph over every obstacle she'd faced. Her story wasn't just hers. Anna Maria was a beacon for others, a testament to resilience. Her health continued to improve, and she began planning a trip to Paris, a dream she'd shelved decades ago. Emily and David cheered her on, their pride a warmth she carried with her. The grandchildren started calling her Author Grandma, a title that made her laugh. As she packed for Paris, she found an old photo of her and Harold, taken on their honeymoon. She didn't burn it this time. Instead, she tucked it away, a reminder of the woman she'd been and the woman she'd become. Paris was everything Margaret had dreamed of and more. The city unfolded before her like a painting, cobblestone streets, the Seine glinting under the autumn sun, the scent of fresh croissants wafting from corner bakeries. At 71, she felt like a young woman again, her red scarf a bright flag against the city's muted elegance. She traveled alone, but she wasn't lonely. The blog's readers had sent messages of encouragement, and she carried their words like companions. She stayed in a small hotel near Montmartre, its walls adorned with faded wallpaper and charm. Each morning, she'd sit at a cafe, sipping espresso and writing in her journal. The words flowed easily now, a mix of memoir and fiction, weaving her story into something universal. She visited the Louvre, stood before the Mona Lisa, and felt a kinship with the enigmatic woman who'd endured centuries of scrutiny. Like her, Margaret had been underestimated, but she was rewriting her narrative. Her health was stable, the cancer in remission. The clinical trial had worked better than expected, and though she still faced regular checkups, the fear that had once consumed her had softened into cautious hope. She walked the city for hours, her body stronger than it had been in years, fueled by determination and the thrill of new beginnings. One evening, at a small bookstore in the Latin Quarter, she gave a reading from her manuscript. The audience was small but attentive, a mix of locals and tourists drawn by a flyer her publisher had distributed. She read a passage about finding strength in betrayal, her voice steady and clear. When she finished, the applause was warm, and a woman in her 60s approached, tears in her eyes. "Your story saved me," the woman said, her voice trembling. "My husband left when I got sick too. I thought I was nothing without him. But you showed me I can keep going." Margaret hugged her, her own eyes misting. This was why she'd written, why she'd fought not just for herself, but for others who needed to know they weren't alone. Back home, her book was gaining traction. The small press had secured a modest print run, and reviews were kind, calling her work raw and uplifting. She did interviews with local papers, her story spreading beyond her blog. Emily and David threw a launch party, filling the house with laughter and love. Jake, now applying to colleges, gave a speech that left her in tears, calling her his hero. Clara updated her on the legal front. Harold had settled, agreeing to spousal support without a fight. The money was a bonus, but the real victory was knowing he'd face the consequences of his choices. Margaret used the funds to set up a scholarship for women pursuing creative dreams later in life, a way to give back the hope she'd found. She kept in touch with her writing group, mentoring younger writers and learning from their energy. Susan, the retired editor, became a close friend, their coffee dates filled with laughter and plans for new projects. Margaret started outlining a second book. This one a novel about a woman who rebuilds her life after loss, inspired by her own journey but woven with imagination. Paris had changed her, not because of its beauty, but because it showed her she could still dream. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving, her life richer for the pain she'd endured. Margaret's book, After the Storm, became a quiet phenomenon. It wasn't a bestseller, but it found its audience, women, mostly, who saw themselves in her words. Letters poured in, emails from strangers who'd read her story and found courage to face their own battles. She answered each one, her heart swelling with purpose. This was her legacy, not the years with Harold, but the lives she touched by refusing to break. Her health remained stable, though the shadow of cancer never fully lifted. She treated each checkup like a ritual, a reminder of her resilience. The red scarf became her signature, a symbol of the woman she'd become: bold, unapologetic, alive. She wore it to speaking engagements, small events at libraries and bookstores where she shared her story. The audiences were modest, but their questions were deep, probing the heart of survival and self-discovery. Emily and David grew closer, their bond with their mother strengthened by her transformation. Jake, now in college, started a blog of his own, inspired by Margaret's courage. He wrote about mental health, a topic he'd struggled with, and credited his grandmother for showing him the power of vulnerability. Margaret read his posts with pride, seeing echoes of her own voice in his words. Clara became more than a lawyer. She was a friend, joining Margaret for dinners where they laughed over shared stories of reinvention. Clara confided that Margaret's case had inspired her to take on more pro bono work, helping women navigate the legal fallout of abandonment. It was another ripple, another way Margaret's pain had sparked change. One day, A letter arrived from Harold. It was brief, scrawled in his familiar handwriting. He'd read her book, he said, and it had broken his heart. He was living alone now. Linda gone. His life a shadow of what it had been. He asked for forgiveness, for a chance to make things right. Margaret read the letter twice, then set it aside. She didn't hate him anymore, but she didn't need him either. She wrote back. A single page. Polite but firm. I forgive you, she wrote, but not for you for me. I'm living my life now, and you're not part of it. She mailed it and felt a weight lift. The final thread of their shared past severed. Her second book took shape. A novel about a woman who builds a community of misfits, each healing from their own wounds. She poured her experiences into a pottery class, the writing group, the strangers who'd become family. It was fiction, but it was also truth, a testament to the connections that had saved her. She started volunteering at a local cancer support group, sharing her story and listening to others. The women there, some younger, some older, became a new kind of family. They laughed, cried, and held each other through the fear and hope of treatment. Margaret brought her journals, reading passages that made them nod in recognition. Their shared strength a quiet rebellion against despair. As her 72nd birthday approached, she planned a trip to Italy, another dream from her journals. She'd go with Susan, who'd never been, their laughter already echoing in her imagination. The world felt wide open, full of possibilities she'd once thought lost. Margaret stood on a balcony overlooking Florence, the Arno River glittering below. At 72, she felt more alive than she had in decades. Italy was a tapestry of color and history, each day a new adventure with Susan by her side. They wandered through markets, tasted gelato under the Tuscan sun, and talked late into the night about dreams and second chances. Margaret's red scarf fluttered in the breeze, a beacon of her transformation. Her second book, The Misfit Haven, was published to warm reviews. It didn't sell as many copies as her first, but it resonated deeply, especially with younger readers who saw their own struggles in its pages. Margaret marveled at the reach of her words, the way they crossed oceans and generations. She'd started as a woman writing to survive, and now she was an author, a voice for those who felt unseen. Her health held steady, the cancer still in remission. She'd learned to live with the uncertainty, to cherish each day without letting fear steal its joy. The support group back home remained a cornerstone, a place where she gave as much as she received. She mentored a young woman, Lily, whose diagnosis mirrored her own. Lily's courage, her fierce determination, reminded Margaret of herself, and their bond grew into a quiet friendship. Emily and David threw a surprise party for her birthday, flying to Florence with their families. The grandchildren ran through the villa they'd rented, their laughter filling the air. Jake, now a college sophomore, gave her a leather-bound journal, inscribed with, "To author Grandma, who taught me to write my truth." She hugged him tightly, tears in her eyes. Clara sent a gift to a framed copy of the spousal support agreement, a cheeky reminder of Margaret's victory. Harold had faded into the background, a footnote in her story. She heard he'd moved to a small apartment, living quietly, alone. She wished him no ill, but she felt no pull to reconnect. Her life was full without him. The scholarship fund she'd started was thriving, helping women like her pursue dreams they'd thought impossible. She received letters from recipients, their gratitude a mirror of her own. One woman, a painter in her 60s, sent a canvas inspired by Margaret's book, its vibrant colors a testament to resilience. As she stood on the balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Margaret felt a profound peace. She'd faced cancer, betrayal, and the weight of a life half-lived. And she'd come through stronger. Her story wasn't just about survival. It was about thriving, about building a life from the ashes of what was. She opened her journal, pen in hand, and wrote, "I am not the woman I was. I am not the woman I thought I'd be. I am more than pain, more than loss, more than anyone's leaving. I am Margaret, and my story is still being written." She closed the journal, her heart full. The world stretched before her, vast and waiting. She'd face it with courage, with love, with the fierce joy of a woman who'd reclaimed her life.